So without any further ado, I want to welcome our presenter, who's Theodore Ted Tomeny, and I guess you go by Ted. We can call you either Dr. Tomeny or Ted. He is the associate. Okay. He is the associate professor and director of undergraduate studies, which I especially love because it shows he has a commitment and a passion for early career researchers at the University of Alabama. He received his PhD from the University of Southern Mississippi. He has really been focusing his research on intellectual and developmental disabilities, specifically focused on families, factors relating to quality of life, treatment outcomes, and looking at factors that influence outcomes or even factors that influence quality of life in family members and siblings, which I think we can all agree is an important and understudied and underserved topic. So he's done systematic reviews, he's done primary experiments, he's done worked with the community. And so we are here to learn a little bit more about what he has been doing, what he has learned, and how his own experience about being a sibling has informed his research. So I am just going to go ahead and turn it over to him.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for having me. I'm really, really happy to be here. Again, I'm Ted Tomeny. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Alabama. And what I hope to share a little bit about is some of our work on risk and resilience in neurotypical siblings. And before I jump into it, again, I want to underscore how important I think the work of this group is, and I'm just so happy that this is available to siblings, and it really is a privilege to be a part of it. So thank you again for having me. Here is a brief agenda just to give you guys an idea of what I'm going to cover. What would a research talk be without some theory? So I'll talk a little bit about some of the theoretical underpinnings of this work and kind of why we might be thinking about these things. I'll talk a little bit about some of the data we have on siblings in childhood and then in adulthood, and then I will wrap it up. I must admit I had a really hard time paring this down and deciding on what to cover. So I may go through some of this a little bit quickly, but I want to be mindful of time and make sure that there is time for discussion. Can definitely go back and clarify things. Feel free to interrupt me with questions. And if I'm starting to run low on time, feel free to interject and I can speed things along. So before I get into our work, I thought it might be helpful to share a little bit about myself. Some of it you already know, but mainly so that you kind of understand the lens through which I see a lot of this and where I'm coming from with our work. So professionally, I'm trained as a clinical child psychologist. I'm mainly an academic, though I'm a researcher. I'm also married. I also have 2 young kids of my own, a 3-year-old little boy and then an almost 9-month-old daughter, which keeps us very, very busy. It's a bit of a miracle that one of them is not home sick with a daycare bug right now. So I have a nice quiet house to give this presentation in, which is nice. But I'm also a sibling, which, last but perhaps most relevant to this conversation, I have 2 brothers. I'm the oldest. My middle brother has autism and ID. My youngest brother is neurotypical. My middle brother is 18 months younger than me, so quite close in age. His autism is pretty classic and was identified very early. He was diagnosed very early, so autism has been a part of our family's lexicon for as long as I can remember. So I'm not going to talk a ton about my personal experience in my slides today. I'm going to focus primarily on the data, but I'm happy to talk more about some of that afterwards if anybody's interested. That makes my wife a sibling in law, and she and I have had some of the conversations that I've heard other adult Sibs have about starting our own family and thinking about future care and things like that. So I'm happy to share if anyone's interested. Okay, so moving right along. So I wanted to start with this very brief quote by some friends of mine, Meg Tudor and Matt Lerner, who I think put it best, that being a sibling in and of itself is not a diagnosis, right? This should be very clear, right? And I'm preaching to the choir a bit with this, but I think it's important to note that being a sibling by itself is not a reason for concern. However, that being said, we do have reasons to think that some siblings may be at a little bit greater risk for some challenges, or they may be put into position for some strengths, right? And so the crux of our work has been trying to identify the situations in which siblings might be in risk for having some of their own challenges to deal with. So that's really what we've been trying to do with a lot of this work. So the other thing that I want to do is take a step back and ask the question, why even study this? And again, I'm preaching to the choir, and the answer is fairly obvious to you all. Probably, right, I would assume, but I think it's helpful to take a step back and ask this question. So I think there's a couple of reasons. There's many, but two that I want to cover. The first one is that, siblings are people too, and just like any other group, they deserve attention and care and love. And if we're able to identify certain subgroups of siblings who might need some type of intervention, we should absolutely do that, right? But I think there's also maybe a bigger picture that we need to consider kind of from a more public health type of perspective. And this is a screenshot of an article from 2019 that I happen to have about the coming crisis or the current crisis that we are in as children with autism start to age out of child services and into adult services. Right, it's probably not news to anyone on this call that diagnostic rates have been increasing pretty dramatically in the last couple of decades. And so what that means, right, is more and more kids are aging out of child-focused care and into these adult service systems. And this crisis has been talked about for a long time now, over a decade. There's a paper from 2011 by Peter Gerhardt that I like to cite, and they were calling it a crisis then. And unfortunately, what this means is that it's probably only getting worse as we're seeing more and more kiddos age out of child services and into adult services. So what does this have to do with siblings, right? Well, who fills the gap, right? Families do. We know this, and the data suggests that siblings are going to be the ones most likely to take over care once parents are no longer able. And so obviously I'm biased in many ways, but I think it's really, really important to be mindful of that and to think about how we can make sure that siblings are being supported and that they feel ready to potentially step into these roles if they're asked to do so. Okay, so this is a really complicated chart here. This is a screen grab from Kovshoff et al. They put together this model. They called it the Sibling Embedded Systems Framework. And I was really grateful for them because they did a lot of the hard work of trying to organize some of these different factors and try to make sense of all the different potential things we would want to be thinking about when we're thinking about predictors of outcomes for siblings. And they took a lot of existing theories and kind of melded them together and adjusted them to make sense for siblings. You probably recognize some terminology from Bronfenbrenner and some others, right? And the majority of the work that we do it primarily focuses on what's inside this red box here. So a lot of our work is focused on within sibling factors, as well as factors that are associated with the family. And then also we look a lot at social support, which you'll see I'll talk about some more in a few minutes. And the other thing I want to highlight here is that, there's so much within the red box, but then there's so much more outside of the red box that we're not even covering with our work. So all that to say is a lot of this just really, really only scratches the surface. Okay, so what does the literature look like, right? Or what's out there already? I think you guys have maybe heard this message already that the research is very mixed on sibling outcomes. There's a lot of variability in the conclusions that are drawn across studies. Some studies, including one of our first ones, suggest no differences when you compare siblings of individuals with autism compared to siblings of individuals with other types of developmental disabilities or other conditions or no condition at all. Other research has suggested there are a lot of positive outcomes identified, that siblings are more resilient, they're more mature, more caring, more helpful, more responsible, right? That's excellent, right? That's very good news. At the same time, however, there is a pretty healthy literature showing some negative outcomes for at least some siblings, right? Sort of general internalizing or externalizing problems, Sometimes siblings report embarrassment or anger, resentment, academic difficulties, and also concerns about the future. And so what I'm really interested in my group and my team is trying to identify the conditions under which we start to see some of these negative outcomes, but also positive outcomes. And a lot of our work involves looking at potential moderators and mediators of some of these fairly well-established bivariate relationships between two different constructs. I use the word try, and I want to underscore that because we do the best that we can, and there are a lot of limitations that I'll get into in just a few minutes, and there's so much more work to be done. But I'll share a few highlights, a few findings that we've come about over the years. Okay, so what do we think about when we think about siblings and what factors to consider? This is a busy slide. I'm not going to go through all of these, but these are just some of the constructs that a lot of the research, including some of ours, has tried to examine. And a lot of times I try to think about this across different levels, or think about different constituents, if you will. So you've got kind of the family unit, right? And then you've got the autistic sibling, you've got the neurotypical sibling, and then you've got caregivers or parents. And within each of those units, if you will, there are potentially, factors that might be at play. People have looked at, things like family size, birth order. I'll talk about that some more in a minute. Gender match, mismatch. Those are kind of almost family level factors. SES, genetics has also been something that's been explored, thinking about the broader autism phenotype. And then factors within the two siblings, so their own level of functioning. Autism symptom severity is another one that we've looked into quite a bit. And then also the caregivers, right? So how are parents handling some of the, unique situations that they may find themselves in? How well are they coping? So you'll see some of these factors come up in just a few minutes. For today's talk, I don't want to get too much into the weeds with methods. I'm happy to provide more information later on, or refer anyone to the papers themselves. But generally speaking, a lot of the data that we collect is online. We use surveys. We try to cast a really wide net and recruit folks from all over the country. We try our best to get both parent report and sibling report when we can. It's not always possible. It's not always appropriate. But I think there's important reasons why we would want to do that, which I'll explain some more in a minute. For the child sample that I'm going to talk about, the ages of the siblings were 11 to 17, so adolescents primarily, right? And then the adult sample that I'll talk about was young adulthood all the way up through older adulthood, 18 to 62. Our recruitment methods were usually targeting ASD support groups. There are also ASD subject pools that are out there, and then word of mouth. So it's very much a convenient sample, right? Which is a big time limitation that's important to keep in mind. And that's a nice segue to my next slide here. So again, before I dive into these results, I just want to put out a few caveats, limitations, disclaimers that I want everyone to be thinking about, keeping in the backs of their mind when digesting this information. So one of the big ones is that our samples are pretty homogeneous, unfortunately. They're primarily white, they're primarily upper middle class, they're primarily individuals who are already in touch with service systems in some way. Okay, so that's a really big limitation, and something I'll come back to at the end of the talk. These are cross-sectional data, right? So think back to your stats 101, that means we can't infer or imply causation, right? These are just snapshots. This next one is not a limitation, but just a note, and it's a good thing actually, that the majority of the siblings in these samples are showing subclinical levels of problems, which means they're in the normal range. That's a good thing. But what we're trying to do is explain variance within these samples and identify those who may be above clinical ranges. Anytime I talk about risk factors, I want to remind everyone that these are not determinants, right? They're just risk factors. Just because you have one of them doesn't mean you're doomed, doesn't mean you're going to necessarily have these problems, okay? And replication. We have a real replication problem in the field in general, and that's no different for this work as well. It needs to be replicated. We need to do it again to make sure that these findings hold true. Okay, so now that I've got all that out of the way, let's dive in. I want to first talk about some of our data on SIBships in childhood and adolescence. So these are some of the variables that we've seen across studies be pretty consistently related to neurotypical sibling psychosocial functioning. So ASD symptom severity, and then emotional or behavioral challenges in the autistic sibling. So these are challenging or problematic behaviors that are not necessarily diagnostic. So things like aggression or anger or conduct problems, sometimes things like elopement, that kind of thing. Things that are often co-occurring but are not diagnostic. SES is another one. We don't spend a ton of time looking at SES, unfortunately, because there's not a whole lot that we can do about SES. Some of these other constructs, we might be able to intervene. Doesn't mean it's not important. It's just not necessarily a focus of ours. And then social support. So social support is one that consistently over and over again is associated with better outcomes. And so you'll see social support come up quite a bit. In fact, it's on the next slide here. So what's pretty well established, right, is that when siblings feel like they have support, they report more positive outcomes or fewer negative outcomes. But we wanted to take it a step further and kind of ask the question, is that for every sibling, or is it that just receiving support is what's important, or does it matter how they kind of view the support, like what they think about the support? And so we had some data available that where siblings reported on the frequency of the support, so how much support they received, and also how important they felt that support was. And this graph that I'm showing you is an example of a technique called polynomial multiple regression and response surface analysis. It sounds very fancy, and it is, but what it is, it's a way to look at your data across 3 different axes or dimensions, and you can see where discrepancy in 2 different variables might relate to a 3rd variable. And so what we're finding with this particular analysis is that when siblings report that social support is highly important, that's where this little red circle is denoting, and they're not receiving a lot of it. So there's a discrepancy between importance and frequency. They're reporting some of the highest levels of problems themselves, right? So it's sort of a mismatch. They see it as very important, but they're not getting very much of it. On the other hand, whenever we see high levels of importance and high levels of frequency, so they're getting a lot of support and they deem it as important, we see the lowest levels of problems. And so this suggests that this might be a point of intervention for us if we find the kiddos who are not getting that support and also perceive it as very important. Those kids might be at higher risk for their own challenges.
Ted, we actually had a question on that last slide.
Yeah.
How are the siblings defining social support in this?
Yeah, so we used a measure for this study. It's called the Child and Adolescent Social Support Scale, and it measures, we're looking at support broadly, but it measures support from parents, teachers, classmates, and friends, and it also measures emotional support, instrumental support, the appraisal support. So it's things like, are these individuals available when you need them? Do they help you with problems that you encounter? Do they make you happy? Those types of things. So it's measuring lots of different factors of support. And it begs the question, though, what if you look at different types of support, right? And that could be a future direction for somebody who might be interested in that kind of work. So again, we're scratching the surface here. There's so many other questions that you could try to answer.
Yeah, we could kind of go down a rabbit hole in that one. So thank you, Jennifer, for the question.
Yes, you absolutely could. Okay, so another relationship that we've tried to untangle a little bit is this association between problem behaviors in the child with autism and then problem behaviors in siblings. And again, ask the question, under what conditions do we see these 2 things being related? And birth order is one of these factors that many have wondered about, right? It doesn't matter if the neurotypical sibling is older or younger than the affected sibling, the diagnosed sibling. And our data suggests that maybe it does, at least in some instances. And what this graph is showing is that when externalizing problems, so these are those kind of like conduct problems, outward facing problem behaviors that we see, when those are high among the child with ASD and the neurotypical sibling is younger, those siblings are going to be reporting the highest levels of their own challenges. And there's a variety of theories as to why this might be happening. Maybe modeling is happening. Maybe the younger children are less skilled at coping with some of those challenges. Yeah, so again, this is just one way that we've tried to further unpack this association between problem behaviors in one child and problem behaviors in another child. So thus far, I focused a lot on kind of negative outcomes, but we also want to think about some of the positive outcomes and resiliency. And one of my graduate students, Lorraine Baker, was really interested in this, and for her dissertation was focused primarily on predictors of life satisfaction in siblings. And we're still trying to unpack these data and working on them, but here's some kind of preliminary analyses. And what I want you guys to focus on is that column to the far right. And what we see, and this isn't this is pretty intuitive, but we see that life satisfaction is negatively associated with problem behaviors and positively associated with social support. So again, it follows a similar trend that we've seen with some of the more negative outcomes, if you will. But I'm sure that this isn't the full story, right? And perhaps in a part two, some years from now, we can explain more. But I just wanted to note that we are looking into more positive outcomes as well. This next set of analyses that I wanted to cover is more of a kind of a methodological question about how we're assessing siblings. So a lot of the research is primarily reliant on a single reporter. A lot of it is parent report, and a lot of that parent report is maternal report from mothers. And so it begs the question, is that adequate? And some of our data suggests that maybe it's not in some ways. And when you compare parents to sibling report, this is on the SDQ, it's the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire. So it's a broadband measure of emotional and behavioral functioning. What we see is that almost across the board, not all of them are statistically significant, but in each category, we see siblings reporting higher levels of distress than their parents. So just something that I think we should all be noting when we're thinking about how we design our studies, and then also maybe how we assess as far as in our clinical work as well. And we looked at it another way. So this is a kind of a complicated table, but I'll walk you guys through it. So the SDQ has risk categories. You're either normal, at risk, or high risk. And what this is kind of a crosstabs comparison between the siblings self-report and the parents report. And the good news is that the majority of the sample is in the normal range. That's that 85 here, right? So the majority are in the normal range, and we see a lot of agreement between parents and siblings. But when you start to get out of the normal range, you start to see a little bit of disagreement. So this box here is showing that for 6 kiddos, the siblings report was in the at-risk range, but their parents' report was in the normal range. And then for 7 of the kids, their report was in the high-risk range and the parents were in the normal range. And you see the vice versa, self-report normal, parent report at risk for 3, and then 6 for high risk. So again, the takeaway is that the majority are in the normal range, and when we see them in the normal range, there's a lot of agreement, which is good. But then when you start to get out of that normal range, you start to see a little bit of disagreement. So I would argue that when we can, it's important to try to get information from multiple informants, and that's not unique to siblings. That's really across the board with a lot of different populations that we work with. Okay, so adulthood. Let's talk about siblings in adulthood. So we collected another sample of siblings of individuals with autism, and then siblings of individuals with ID without autism. Okay, and these were all adult siblings, and our primary focus was on the relationship and correlates of positive or negative sibling relationships, right? And we use the measure called the LSRS, the Lifespan Sibling Relationships Scale, and it measures a variety of different components of sibling relationships. it measures things like, my sibling and I are friends, or I enjoy spending time with my sibling, or there's some negatively valenced items as well, like there's something like my sibling made me miserable when we were children. So, it gets at some of the maybe not so glamorous parts of being a sibling. But when we put this sample together and we look at both ASD and ID without ASD, we see that relationship quality was positively related to aid provided. So we also measured how much aid the sibling is providing their affected siblings. So you can kind of think of that as like an involvement measure. Is also positively related to life satisfaction. Again, that makes a lot of sense, right? And then it was negatively related to depressive symptoms and stress, right? So again, that makes sense. So as sibling relationships are better, we see less report of stress and depressive symptoms. But another question that we had was, is there a difference between the ID group and the ASD group in sibling relationship quality? And in fact, we did see that. The ASD group reported on average lower levels of positive sibling relationship attitudes. Now, both groups were pretty high, I should note that. So that means that the ASD group was just lower, not bad, but just lower than the ID, right? So, that's kind of interesting, but we wanted to take it a step further and see whether or not sibling relationship quality might serve as a mediator of the relationship between being in the ID or ASD group and some of these outcomes. And in fact, we found that it did, at least for depressive symptoms, stress, and aid provided. And when that suggests that the sibling relationship quality could be another point of intervention for us. If we can help improve the sibling relationship, or at least help people maybe see it a little bit differently and perhaps a more positive way, that might actually yield some of these downstream improvements in some of these downstream factors like depressive symptoms, stress, and then involvement. Okay, so the last construct that I want to cover, almost done, is this idea of parentification. Maybe some of you have heard of this. It's not as well known as some of these other constructs, but this is when children start to assume roles and responsibilities that are typically reserved for adults. And generally speaking, high levels of parentification are associated with negative outcomes. It's not usually a good thing. But prior to this study, there was some evidence from Cridlin et al. that parentification that's focused on the sibling might actually be associated with positive outcomes. Perhaps there's something there. And so we wanted to further explore that. And one thing I want to make sure I note is that we had these adult siblings retrospectively report on parentification during childhood. Okay, so that's a big, sort of caveat or limitation, because we know a retrospective report has problems. So just keep that in mind. And generally, we found evidence to support these previous findings that when you look at parent-focused parentification here in red, it was related to higher levels of anxiety and higher levels of stress. When you look at sibling-focused parentification, the far right column in green, it was related to more positive sibling relationship attitudes. So all of these relationship quality here, those are the different subscales of the LSRS, the measure that we use to measure sibling relationship attitudes. And so this is just at the bivariate level here, but we ran these analyses again more stringently with a variety of different covariates, and these effects held even under those more conservative conditions. So that's kind of interesting, right? Perhaps sibling-focused parentification is related to some resiliency, at least with respect to how the neurotypical sibling views their relationship. But we wanted, again, to dive into this a little bit further, and our buddy social support is here again. And we know that social support oftentimes can act as a buffer between a stressor and an outcome. And so what we found with these analyses is for siblings who were reporting high levels of parent-focused parentification, so this is just looking at parent-focused parentification, and low levels of support, they were reporting the highest levels of distress. Whereas for those who were experiencing high social support, it didn't matter how much parentification they reported, right? So it just didn't matter for them. So you can kind of think of it as the lack of social support as perhaps a risk factor in this situation. And then with these analyses, we were focused on the sibling-focused parentification. And what we found here is that for siblings who were reporting low levels of sibling-focused parentification and low levels of social support, they were reporting the poorest or the most negative sibling relationship attitudes. And so in some ways, another way to think about this is that perhaps high levels of sibling-focused parentification are sort of maybe a resiliency factor. It's sort of perhaps having a positive impact on the sibling relationship if the siblings feel like they have some support. Okay, so trying to pull it all together, there's a lot of other stuff that I could cover, but those are just some highlights. I think at the end of the day, it's important to remember most Sibs are doing okay, right? They're doing all right. That's a good thing. In fact, many of them are doing very well. They're overachievers, right? They're going well above and beyond. But some of them might be struggling, and we've been able to identify a pattern of different factors that are associated with increased risk. What I've noticed is that it's rarely ever one factor, right? It's a combination of different things that likely need to be in place. But there's a lot of questions that still are, left unanswered. So, what does the future look like for this work? At least in my opinion, I think we need more longitudinal studies, right? We need to follow kids over time and look at differences in development. There's some work looking at traits and coping styles within siblings, but I think there's more room for that. We need more voice from the autistic siblings, and that's a huge limitation of our work. And I'll be the first to admit that we don't have that. It's challenging. It presents some additional, complications with trying to design studies, but we need to hear from those autistic Sibs about their perceptions of sibling relationships. And we need to diversify our samples, big time. That's a huge need. And then look to the future with adult Sibs, right? This is some work that I want to get into some more personally, but we really need to, I think, focus our attention on adult Sibs and make sure that they're ready to take on the roles that they may find themselves in. I couldn't do any of this work without my team. Tammy Berry was my doctoral advisor. She's fantastic. She guided me through all this early work. Stephanie was one of my lab mates, and then the rest are former and current trainees who are incredibly helpful and brilliant. And then, of course, the families who participated, because without them, none of this work would be possible.